Thank you all for coming. I'm Dale Hagan. I'm the president of the board of Friends of Peralta Hacienda Historical Park, and it's great to see you all here today, including some of the folks that I can see who are on our panels as we're looking here. I would like to actually introduce to you UC Berkeley Professor Alex Saragoza, who has been a long-time partner with us in bringing these stories in this site alive. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass this to Professor Alex Saragoza.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dale, for the introduction. But the real star of this show is the person who has invested so much time, effort, and it dwarfs my imagination, the kind of energy that she has in this respect. So I'm going to ask her to say a few words about the event today and the new panels that we have and the events that will be coming up. And then I will speak for roughly 3 hours regarding the film. Sorry, it's my Fidel Castro imitation. But I want to introduce Jali Alonso, who is the heart and soul in many respects of this place.
Hola, bienvenidos. Hi, everyone. I am the shared heart and soul, along with Isel, Wells, Francisco, Bonnie, Dale, everyone who's been a part of this. Arturo, our panadero, Calvin, our videographer, and all of you who've been a part of Peralta Hacienda. Kim, May, our wonderful community gardener, whose story you can read over there. And Itzel and Itzel's mother as well has become an integral part of everything here. So thank you for coming. Should I say that all in Spanish? Di gracias a todo el mundo que ha ayudado tanto. Itzel, su madre, los miembros de la junta directiva, el panadero Arturo Peña, y seguro el director de nuestro programa para las escuelas, Wells Twombly, todos dan todo lo que tenemos para que este sitio tan importante a Oakland y a su historia y a nuestro sentido de comunidad entre nosotros que triunfe, que dure, que se hace más grande. Y what this exhibit you're seeing today, it's a temporary exhibit. And it will be replaced by a beautiful building, a museum without walls. Este sitio, esta exhibición que todos vieron ahora, es no para siempre, no es permanente, va a ser reemplazado por un edificio, un museo sin paredes, para que los cuentos de esta comunidad se conozcan por el público entero. Y queremos mucho, y yo creo que usted también va a decir eso, we want very much for you to leave your comments. You see that little table there with brightly colored paper? Esa mesita con papeles de muchos colores, que escriban lo que piensan, lo que quieran ver, los cuentos que no estén, que quieren, o si piensan que son demasiado largos o cortos o lo que piensan, que escriban, porque eso nos ayudará a conseguir más fondos para hacer el edificio permanente. So if you write your comments, and you can say anything, you can say enthusiastic things or criticisms, like that it's too much information, not enough, why didn't we tell so-and-so's story? Please put all of that down there. This is about half the number of stories that will be in the eventual museum, but they can be changed over and over again by different community members and groups and individuals. Lo que ven es más o menos la mitad de los cuentos que pueden caber en el edificio del futuro, pero y así que pueden decir lo que quieran, y también los cuentos van a cambiar frecuentemente. I don't think I was supposed to talk about all of that just now. Oh, well. Lo que debía de decir fue que, pero también es el profesor Saragoza va a decirlo, que a las 4 habrá dos actividades muy importantes. Uno para los adultos, que es una película de la serie Latino Americans, latinoamericanos, y también en medio de todo va a haber actividades para niños, para que conozcan el rancho de la familia Peralta. Entonces eso va a pasar a las 4 y hasta entonces hay comida, música y creo que un caballo va a venir también. There's going to be a horse, food, music, and viewing this exhibit. And please reply, write your comments on that table and leave us your impressions. All right, now we better start with Alex's 3 hour.
Are you going to tell them about the events coming up and so forth?
Oh, okay, yes. Okay, so esto es el comienzo de todo un año de eventos sobre la cultura latinoamericana. Y esto es the premiere, the opening, la apertura de estreno de todo, sí. Y que vengan a todos sus eventos. Hay una carta postal con la lista de todo lo que va a haber en esta serie. So there's going to be a whole year of cultural events, and there's a little postcard that tells what they are. I suppose we have those. Itzel?
Aquí estoy.
Yeah, sí, que las tarjetas postales con la lista de eventos
Están acá. They're right over there. If you guys want to grab one, they say what is our history. There is like half of a page. Just ask for them, and he has a list of all the events that we're going to have.
And especially a big festival next June, which will have a dance contest and food demonstrations, and it will be called Fruit Veil First, because part of our mission is that Fruit Veil become known, para que el público conozca Fruitvale, porque es un distrito tan interesante, tan lleno de vida, que es muy importante que toda la área de la bahía conozca a nuestra comunidad. Y ahora creo que el señor Saragoza, el profesor Saragoza, va a hablar sobre la película y unas otras cosas.
Buenas tardes. Creo yo que es un poco aburrido de cambiar al inglés y español y tratar de traducir todo, ¿no? Entonces, si me permiten, voy a resumir lo que voy a decir en inglés, en español, para ustedes que tal vez lo prefieren así, pero por mi parte a dividir la plática y como quiero hablar por 3 horas, entonces vamos a estar aquí 6 horas. Broma, ¿no? Media hora máximo. En primer lugar, la cuestión de la película. Y en este momento voy a cambiar el inglés. The film that you're going to see is part of a 4-part series on Latinos in the United States. And as you can imagine, for someone who tries to capture the experience of Spanish-speaking people arriving here in California in the 18th century and then taking the story all the way up to the present, that includes not only the Spanish-speaking people who considered themselves part of the Spanish Empire, and then those people who eventually became part of what at one time was called Mexico, and then in addition, Cubans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, plus the generational changes after that. That's a big story. And to bring it down to 4 hours was a huge challenge. And later today, after the film, one of the producer-directors of one of those episodes will be here to discuss the difficulty of doing that. Porque si ustedes pueden pensar de capturar lo que es todo el grupo de latinos en Estados Unidos, gente de Chile, etcétera, es una historia larguísima, ¿no? Y en ese sentido de ponerlo en 4 horas es un reto terriblemente complicado. Okay? Bien. Now, for me as a historian, one of the real difficult parts of telling any story is not only to choose what you put in, but also, like in any story, if you don't have a lot of time, and that's why I was kidding about the 3 hours. I don't have 3 hours. So what things do you take out of the story in order to let it fit in a box that's an hour long, 30 minutes long, whatever it is? Porque cualquier historia, uno tiene que decidir qué poner en la historia y las cosas que uno no va a mencionar. ¿Sí? Es como mis estudiantes en Berkeley, porque se van a conocer nuevas personas. Entonces, en ese momento de ese conocimiento, si la muchacha o el muchacho son muy guapos, muy bonitas, y uno le pregunta, ¿tienes una novia? Entonces, inmediatamente él o ella tiene que decidir de decir una mentirita, no tengo, o sí tengo, pero estoy libre, o lo que sea, ¿no? Entonces, la cuestión de qué poner y qué sacar. En la película que van a ver, the film that you're going to see raises a lot of questions. And one of the questions is, what is left out of that first episode, and if we had the time, all the other episodes? And as I mentioned earlier, my colleague, Ray Diaz, who is in the back, will be here later to discuss the difficulties of producing and directing and writing a documentary and having to make that big decision of what to put in and what you leave out. And I want to talk more about what is left out rather than necessarily what you will see. And I want to start with the very first, almost at the very beginning of the film. It talks about the arrival of the missionaries, Father Sarah, 1769, in what is now called San Diego. But the question is, if Hernán Cortés is in what we now call Mexico City, already by 1519, and allegedly the Spaniards begin to control central Spain, then why did it take so long for Spanish-speaking people to come here to California? Why didn't they do it 50 years later, or 75 years later, or even 100 years later? Why did it take basically 250 years for Spanish-speaking people to get here in the first place? If California was so beautiful, so bountiful, etc., then why didn't that happen? And that's left out of the story. And a big part of that has to do with Spain, what Spain was confronting at the time, and I'll only mention one thing. Spain was involved in suppressing this new religious movement that became known as Protestantism. And the Vatican gave the Spanish crown the responsibility, to a large extent, of suppressing the Protestant movement in Europe in that time. And from roughly 1550 until 1650, 100 years, Spain was fighting all over Europe, trying to maintain Catholicism in Europe. Spain then, a lot of its wealth, a lot of its energy, a lot of its military capability then was strewn all over Europe, taking those resources away. And if we think about just the Vietnam War, which wasn't too long ago, well, I see most of you here are very young. You don't remember that. But we spent $120 billion, more or less, on fighting the war in Vietnam. And we only spent around $15 billion in trying to lessen poverty here in the United States that became known as the War on Poverty program. So wars can take a lot of resources. Think about $120 billion being used to fund college students, for example. Tells you something about how resources can be allocated. So in this film then, we pick up the story more or less around 1769, and we don't ask the question, why the missionaries? Because there's a secular clergy who don't take the same vows as many of these Dominicans, Augustinians, and in the case of Father Sarah, Franciscans. So that's another part of the story. Why is it that the Franciscans, Jesuits, and so on, were sent to the boonies, because this was the boonies of the Spanish Empire. As my colleague David Weber talks about the rim of empire. This was the very rim. This was the absolute edge of the Spanish Empire. And the clergy that came was of a particular type. The secular clergy stayed more into the interior, etc. Así que habían dos tipos de religiosos. Las personas como el padre Serra, que era un franciscano, y por otro lado, los religiosos que no tenían los mismos obligaciones, responsabilidades, etc., de los misiones que vinieron aquí a California. Y su actitud ante los indígenas eran distinto a lo que fue los religiosos que se quedaron en el centro, se puede decir, del Imperio Español, en lo que hoy es México. Bueno, another point that the film doesn't have time to cover, but that I think is really important, is when the film has to decide what part of what we now call the American Southwest to focus on. And as you will see in the film, they focus on New Mexico, on Texas, and California, despite the fact that the Spanish Empire extended into the interior, which now includes what we now call Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Oklahoma, etc. For our purposes here, what's important is to think about why was New Mexico so different from Texas, and why Texas is so different from California, going back even to that period of time. And much of it has to do with the conditions faced in, say, Texas, as opposed to California, as opposed to New Mexico. I don't have the time to talk about each one, but because there isn't a great deal of attention paid to the differences here as opposed to Texas. And I'll just mention one that the film discusses to some extent, but again, a lack of time doesn't allow us to understand the detail. The arrival of people like Austin, Stephen Austin, Moses Austin, and so on, which are, of course, reified, idealized, romanticized, if you want, in Texas history in that regard. The question is why? Because in the film it talks about Apaches, Comanches, and they were not the only tribes on the way from the other side of the Mississippi River into what we now call Texas. So if there were indigenous groups that were not necessarily kind and wonderful toward the people coming across, who were in fact either hostile or at the very least mistrustful of those people coming in, then why did those people take the risk of coming across that prairie, if you will, and ending up in what we now call East and Central Texas? Because if the oxen would have gotten sick pulling the wagon, that's it. If they would have lost both wheels of the wagon, that would have been it. Not to mention being attacked by one of the hostile tribes along the way. What was motivating those people to take on that risk? Not to mention the possibility of storms, the possibility of not being able to cross the river. We're discussing right now the question in South Carolina. It didn't rain for 2 days, but the water kept coming up because of the hill country sending down water and re-raising in many respects, and so on. And the same thing could pass on the streams, the creeks, the rivers, that many of those people had to cross, and if they couldn't cross, they had to wait until the water went down. Not to mention perhaps losing their provisions as they try to cross the stream, the wagon tilts over to one side, everything falls out. En ese sentido, la migración de norteamericanos hacia lo que es el caso de Texas, por ejemplo, tenían que atravesar una serie de peligros, etc. Pero sin embargo, llegaron. Como los mexicanos llegan desde Chiapas, de Campeche, de Quintana Roo, a veces en los camiones que yo tomé una vez desde Mérida hasta Tijuana, más de 60 horas, pero eso fue en camión. Fíjense ustedes en caballo o por un burro o nomás caminando y caballo, sería meses de llegar. Entonces, ¿por qué? and again, something that the film can get to, and that is the importance of a series of recessions that occurred in the early part of the 19th century, including a very hard recession that went from 1837 until 1841. Thousands and thousands of farmers lost their shirts, in a manner of speaking, and had to start all over again. Many small businesses that depended on farmers and so on. When the agricultural prices went down and so on, those small businesses also had to close shop. Does that sound similar to what happened here between 2007 and 2009? And of course, in certain parts of the United States, we're still recovering from that recession. So people then were desperate. What do we do now? And if you stop and think about cotton being the major source of foreign revenues for the United States, where would they want to go? They would want to go toward land that was fertile, land that had easy access to water, and given the fact that Texas was relatively close by, it's understandable that they would come into Texas. But they were desperate. These were desperate people. We got to find a stake, we got to find a place to stay, etc. And by this time, a phenomena, again, that the film can't quite explain in its entirety, had already taken hold, going all the way back to the beginning of the 18th century when we had the Louisiana Purchase and so forth and so on, where there were no surveyors, there was no police. People started to do what became known as squatting. And if you look at the land policy of the United States from 1787, 1820, 1841, what we see is an increasing ability of people to acquire land more and more easily. And it gets to the point, the Preemption Act of 1841, that essentially if you go into an area and you plant a tree, in a manner of speaking, right, and you have a shack or something that you build, a lean-to, that is considered a homestead. And later, of course, the Homestead Act of 1862. So squatting had become a safety valve for a lot of people who economically could not deal with what we would call now a recession, had to close their little shop, their clothing store, had to break down their smithing equipment and so on and move further out in the hopes of finding a place where they could make a living and so forth and so on. And in that respect, the phenomenon known as squatting didn't happen after the gold rush. It had been going on for at least 50, 60 years prior. So Mr. Vallejo, who is given a great deal of attention in the film, and the Texans in Texas had to contend with all of these people who said, hey, nothing's going on here. There's cattle and so on. I'm going to start a farm here, and this is going to be my claim, in a manner of speaking. And much of this was done, what we would say, illegal. And in that respect, a lot of illegal aliens came in to what was then called Texas in order to start their claim, in a manner of speaking. En ese sentido, muchos norteamericanos llegaron a Texas y bajo lo que ellos vieron como un derecho, establecieron lo que sería una milpa o algo por el estilo, ¿no? Entonces, a través de esa milpa, entonces ellos consideraron que esto es legal, esto es mío. A pesar que muchos de los ranchos en Texas, como en California, ya estaban bajo el mandado legal de las personas que estaban allí antes que llegaron los norteamericanos. Y esa parte de la historia norteamericana, desgraciadamente por falta de tiempo, no se puso en la película. Okay, another point in the film that again, for lack of time, etc., and that is the life of the Californians. To some extent, the film focuses on those moments where the Californians, with their horses, with their cattle, etc., had a really good life here. But my good friend Wells here can tell you, life on this frontier was tough, very tough. It was not easy. The notion that the Spanish-speaking elite, like the Vallejos and so on, were having dances every week and this sort of thing, and people dancing till 3 hours, into 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then resting for a while, then getting up the next morning, let's party again. Well, maybe that happened 2 or 3, 4 or 5 times a year, maybe. But what's important here is to understand the incredible adversities faced, whether it was in New Mexico, or whether it was in Texas, or whether it was here in California, regarding what life was like on the frontier. If you stop and think about how long it takes by car at 5 o'clock from, say, Hayward to where I live in Martinez, it can take an hour to an hour and a half. And for some of us, that's way too long. We get impatient, we start doing bad things on the road, and so on. Well, you can imagine by horseback or on a wagon how long it would take to get from Hayward to Martinez, for example. And in that respect, it's not like you could go party every week, because sometimes it could take you a week to get back to where you started from in that respect. It could get very lonely at the edge of the Spanish Empire. And in that respect, that loneliness is totally left out of the film, where for weeks, and sometimes longer, months, you didn't see anyone, you didn't talk to anyone other than your immediate family, the workers, most of them of indigenous origin, and this sort of thing. And that was it. That was it. No electricity, no DVDs, no Xfinity, no Comcast. It was routine. Day after day, you get up early, you do the work, whatever the work needs to be done, you come and eat, more work, and meanwhile, usually the female members are working in order to get the food done, all right? No Carl's Jr.'s, no pizza being delivered, no way of doing things quickly, no appliances, no stoves. You have to start a fire. You chop wood in the morning, you chop wood after breakfast, chop wood in noon, chop wood again after lunch, chop again, and then you have to chop more in order to start the fire at night in order to keep things warm on a cold night. Does that sound like a lot of fun? I don't think so, all right? But again, all of that is left out. There's a point in the film that I think is particularly contentious, and that's when a good friend of mine and a good colleague, I think it was a soundbite that was cut, where she said, these people spent lots of money, or something to that effect. Well, money didn't circulate very much in this area. It wasn't like people had bank accounts, ATM machines. Hey, let's party, let's take out $500, and this sort of thing. Most people had an economy of bartering, and that included the Spanish-speaking elite. They bartered their horses, their cattle, their hides, and so on, in exchange for provisions of various sort and the other. It wasn't like they had money. They had dollars, which I don't have in my wallet right now, sort of thing, for a good reason. But anyway, that's another story. But the important point here is the notion that the Spanish-speaking elite had this incredible, wonderful life of parties and good eating and wonderful clothes, etc. Most of them didn't look like those pictures because they're posed. I'm part of that generation. All of you here are much too young to remember. But there was a time when people didn't have cameras. And the only time you took a picture is a wedding, a baptism, maybe a funeral where the family gets together, right? Because so-and-so finally passed away. And you always posed. And you got dressed up a little bit for those pictures. You didn't show up in your regular clothes, whatever that might be. And in that sense, again, the pictures that we have too often are posed. And you see the Spanish-speaking elite with their beautiful outfits and so on, the women in their dress like Itzel over here, and they're resplendent in a beautiful blouse and so forth. But most of them, in fact, didn't dress that way on a day-to-day basis. So in that respect, we kind of get a different picture of what life was like on the Spanish frontier in that period of time. Era otra realidad de vivir cada día lo que es la vida cotidiana. Fue muy difícil, con mucho trabajo. Y no habían los fandangos, los famosos bailes, etc. Tal vez 2 o 3 veces al año. Pero afuera de eso, era muy raro. The next part of the film or one part of the film. Again, for lack of time, no doubt. The Texas Revolt of 1836. One of the leaders of that revolt was a man by the name of Juan Seguin. And his story, a very moving story actually, is in the film. But what's left out is a clear explanation of why in 1836, Seguin, like other Tejanos, decided to go on the side of Norteamericanos in order to fight against Mexico. And they mentioned Santana, who was a centralist at the time, a dictator at the time, authoritarian, wanted power. Mexico City and all the states had to go along with what Mexico City said. Well, Santana was a liberal, then he was an authoritarian, then he became liberal again, and then he became an authoritarian again. So when he went to Texas, he had already been in and out of power 5 times, with 5 different parties, if you will. That's left out. But more importantly was the question of federalism versus centralism. And Seguin, like many other Mexicans, had to fight against the conservatives that wanted to maintain the basic Spanish order after Mexican independence, which occurred finally in 1821. And from 1821 all the way through 1867, Mexico went through a series of civil wars, some lasting only 6 months, some lasting 2 or 3 years. And in that respect, Mexico, already devastated by a 10-year war in order to get independence, had to then go back, in a sense, into another period of civil strife in order to sustain themselves against outside forces, but were unable to do so. Parentheses. This was after the Monroe Doctrine. And as we all know from U.S. history, the United States Navy blew away the Spaniards as they approached Brownsville. Never happened. We protested, but we did nothing. But that's another story. Okay. The Monroe Doctrine later is an interesting part of what happens between the United States and Latin America. In this regard, then, the Disney kind of impression that we too often have of Santana's force marching up to Texas is you have these Mexican soldiers resplendent in blue uniforms and so on, and horses and cannon and this sort of thing. Half of Santana's army were draftees, most of them indigenous people, most of them badly equipped, who had to march from various parts of what we now call Michoacan, Hidalgo, etc., along the road all the way up to Texas. And according to my good friend, historian Zoraida Vasquez, literally half of his force had deserted by the time they got to Texas. In the middle of the night, and keep in mind these indigenous people were not given horses, were not given muskets and this sort of thing. They were basically taken to take care of the horses and the men and so on. They would just disappear at night because they had no loyalty necessarily to this ambiguous thing called Mexico. So the notion that Santana had all these artillery and so on, who was going to carry those cannonballs? It wasn't going to be Santana. So many of the indigenous people who came up with him, that's what's supposed to be their job. Well, in that respect, and on many times during the assault on the Alamo, they only had enough cannonballs to shoot it maybe 3 times a day. And that was it. So this Disneyland kind of notion that Santana had this incredible army behind him and so on, to a large extent, is way over exaggerated. And the best example of that was happened a few days later at the Battle of San Jacinto, where what was left of Santana's troops basically are decimated in about 15 minutes. Totally caught off guard, in part because many of the soldiers were so badly trained and so forth and so on. But that's another part of the story that can't be said. Seguin goes to Mexico eventually in order to escape, as you will see, his conditions in Texas. But what I want to emphasize is Mexico having to deal with the devastation of being under colonial rule for over 300 years, where virtually all of the wealth of the country doesn't stay in Mexico, it goes elsewhere. And if you ever go to the cathedral in Burgos, Spain, you go to the cathedral in Madrid, you go to the cathedral in Sevilla, all three of the cathedrals have what they call treasure rooms. They're behind the sacristy. And in the case of Burgos, the area behind the altar is at least, goes from that wall all the way here to the edge of where we have these posters. And the thing that got me was the bishop's carriage. The bishop's carriage would parade the bishop around Burgos during religious festivals. It's made of solid silver. Solid. Think about a big wagon made solid silver. The wheels, the wagon itself, made of, and they had a little thing like the Pope Mobile where he holds on. A bar of solid silver. Just one example. Not to mention the rubies and the emeralds and the gold, etc., that ends up in the form of crucifixes, chalices, and so on. And in that respect, a lot of that wealth that could have been invested in Mexico ends up in Spain. So how does a country recover from that? It's not going to be easy in the beginning of the 19th century. The last part of the story that, again, I don't have the time to address fully. Okay.
I just want to interject that the kids' activities are starting over there, the rancher activities, because that's what's happening at this point. So here's Alex with this presentation.
Okay, thank you. At the very end of the film, they discuss the gold rush and the impact on the Spanish-speaking people, including land loss. And remember what I mentioned about squatting and this sort of thing. But I want to emphasize the gold rush. If for no other reason, I'm a fan of the San Francisco 49ers, with all due respect to the Raiders. But when they moved to LA, I cut them off and went over to the Raiders. All right? But that's another story, and I apologize for all of you that remain black and white Raider fans. The gold rush went through 4 stages. And what's important about the 4 stages is because the Chilenos and the Peruanos y los Mexicanos llegaron primero, por razón que estaban mucho más cerca de lo que es California, llegaron entonces en esa primer etapa de lo que es aquí en Estados Unidos, en California, el gold rush, ¿no? La llegada de muchas personas buscando el oro, etc. Why is the first stage important? Because that's when the gold was most easily taken out of the ground, taken from streams, and so forth and so on. And there are stories where Antonio Coronel, who came all the way from Los Angeles to come to the gold rush, literally could kick the ground and he would find gold. Right? And that's why we planted gold nuggets here. So that after I finish, no, I'm kidding. Right? As opposed to the second stage, because by the second stage, that easy period of finding gold had been reduced. And all during this time, people are coming from Illinois, from Iowa, from New York, Wisconsin, Michigan, not to mention Georgia, South Carolina, and so on, because they hear about what might be happening here. All right? But, of course, they have to come a long way. They come on horseback, they come on wagons, they come on ships that went through what we now call the Isthmus de Tehuantepec and so on, and get on ships, and then they come up the coast or have to go around the Horn of South America and so on. It took them months and sometimes even longer to get to California. So by the time they get here, those easy pickings, in a manner of speaking, were gone. It's kind of like if you're a guy and you show up to a dance and you're the last one to get there, and meanwhile all the other guys are there and they have taken all the partners in a sense, and you're left out of the cold. In a sense, in many respects, that's what happened. A lot of frustration, a lot of anger, because they would arrive and all that easy stage was over. Now, I don't know how many of you pan for gold. Anybody pan for gold? If you ever pan for gold, there is a technique. It's not something that you can learn in 5 minutes. It's kind of like unpacking a piece of furniture from IKEA with those easy to read instructions and with a print this big that goes 10 pages sort of thing, all right? Took me 3 days to put together I forget what it was, some kind of furniture that I bought there. Never went to IKEA again, all right? Because my wife laughed at me for 3 days. You haven't put it together yet, sort of thing, all right? Well, if you ever go panning for gold, there are various steps involved. One is knowing how to do it. Now, some Latinos, genetically, we know how to do it, right? That is, we have to get this hip action going, right? And tilt the pan at a particular angle in order so that you get rid of the water, the sand, and so on, and the gold stays. You also have to know where in the stream to place yourself in order to try and capture enough of this gravel, etc., that might have the gold in that respect. And if you're skilled, you know exactly where to place yourself. But if you don't know, you're all going all over the stream and this sort of thing, probably going into a hole and have to come up and this sort of thing. Well, imagine what it would be like. You finally get there. You're from Peoria, Illinois. You go all the way to the Horn. You go to San Francisco. You buy your last you buy with your last bit of $1 or $2 or $3 the boots and the pick and the axe and the shovel. You buy a beat-up old donkey or horse and so on, and you head out to what we now call Marysville or whatever it is, and you get there, and you don't know what you're doing. And meanwhile, a lot of people have invested in you coming out here. It's like paying for an education at Stanford, but you don't go to class. Some parents would get really upset in that regard. They get here and they see the Peruvians, the Chilenos, the Mexicans who know what they're doing. Picking up, taking from their pan, taking from their sluice box, these nuggets. And now, do you think the attitude was, ¡y qué bien! El oro que pescaste, qué bien, híjola, estoy muy feliz por ti. No. I think they would get really frustrated to see those people putting in their pockets that gold, those nuggets, and so on. And they're still trying to figure out where in the heck to put myself in the stream. And a lot of the violence that's discussed in the film regarding the gold rush has a lot to do with that desperation, with that anger, with that frustration. And think about all those men who left their families behind, thinking that they would get here, strike it rich, and be back home within 6 months or a year, loaded with gold, bringing all those wonderful resources back to a woman who's been backbreaking work for a year or 6 months, 8 months, and so forth and so on. And finding out that, in fact, they didn't find it, they didn't make it, and they come back basically penniless. And many stories, if you read about the gold rush, we tend to always focus on the ones who did well. We don't focus on the 92% who failed. 92% of the miners that came during that period of time from other parts of the United States never struck it rich. At best, they broke even. And that's why a lot of women were left abandoned. Families were left abandoned by the thousands in various parts of the United States because their menfolk either didn't come back or worse, were so humiliated by not being able to cross that if they don't make it the first time, they don't say, oh, I didn't make it, me voy a Michoacán, a Zacatecas, o lo que sea. No, tratan una vez más, y una vez más, y una vez más. ¿Por qué? Porque si regresan, después, mira, pagamos esto para que llegues a la frontera, y después de la primera vez, regresas, ¿cómo vas a pagar la familia? Por todos esos recursos que invertimos en ti para llegar, para que tú pudieras llegar aquí a Estados Unidos para vivir mejor. In the same way, a lot of those miners then started to squat, started to take land, desperate to find some means of eking out a living, given the failure of being able to find that gold. And again, for any person who does a documentary, any person who writes a history like myself, that is one of the hardest questions, is what to put in. Because that film, if it would have covered all the things I just said, just that one episode that you're going to see, rather than lasting about an hour or so, would have been easily 3 hours perhaps. And Ray and I collaborated in a film, a two-part film on the Mexican Revolution. And I remember when we brought in all these historians from various parts of the United States, including some from England and Germany and so on. And Alan Knight, one of the most distinguished historians of Mexico in the Mexican Revolution, I'll never forget, he says, well, I think you need 6 hours. And we said, you know how much it's going to cost just for 2 hours? There's no way we can put all of that story in. And I remember grappling with the question, well, hey, the revolution took place in Yucatan and Quintana Roo. And Ray and I had to ask ourselves, are we going to put every state? Because every state has a monumento a la revolución, el coronel este, el general este, qué sé yo, de Tabasco, Campeche, etc. You can't do it all. And we had to make real hard decisions, what to put in and what to take out. So what you're going to see is, in many respects, a fragment of a very complex, very complicated history. And Ray, who will discuss the film after it is shown, it's going to start at 4 o'clock, so we're going to give a little time to get some tamales or some food and this sort of thing. Check on your children if that's the case, and so on. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful day. We could have been in San Francisco, we could have been in wine country, we could have been just staying home in the backyard, having a glass of white wine with a little quesito and things of that nature, which I wish I could do, but I can't. I have to go to my 70th high school reunion. Yeah. Do I look good? Yeah. All right. You should see the makeup I had to put on this morning. Yeah, very good. All right. So on that note, and I do hope you stay to hear Ray, who actually was one of the producers and directors of one of the episodes of that series called Latino Americans, because he can tell you how difficult it is to be a filmmaker. It's bad enough as a historian, because I can write pages and pages and pages, but when you only have 60 minutes to tell a complicated story, it makes it even tougher. Because every historian, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you put in that? And believe me, it's a difficult choice. Thank you very much.